Well, let me begin by thanking Professor David Bebbington and those at Baylor who extended this invitation to be with you all. It's an honor to join many of you who've been path breakers for the academic study of Latin American evangelicalism. With that in mind, let me begin with a story. About 2 p.m., we heard the roar of furious thousands, and like a river let loose, they rushed down on our house. Paving stones were quickly torn up, windows and doors were smashed, and about 1,000 voices were crying for blood. On October 1st, 1902, British Brethren missionary Will Payne confronted the harsh reality of a religious monopoly in Cochabamba, Bolivia. In his diary account tucked away in the National Library of Scotland, Payne watched helplessly as a surging mob, in his words, easily pushed aside local authorities, wounded the police chief, and breached the Payne's front door. After the door gave way, Payne recalled, "I was beaten to the ground and dragged by the feet through the patio, while the cry went up, 'To the flames with the Protestant!'" He watched from the floor as the family furniture and book collection were doused in kerosene and lit aflame. "We committed ourselves to the Lord, scarcely expecting to live 10 minutes. No sooner had Payne accepted death than the crowd began to scatter as a cavalry regiment charged down the street, provoking panic. Several soldiers slashed at running campesinos with their swords. In Payne's engrossing account, his family huddled over the ashes of their household belongings in stunned silence. Payne penned, "The poor children, I was told, were being carried away to the flames when some police officer snatched them up." At first glance, it appears odd to begin with this vivid vignette of violence in a paper that promises to discuss historiography. The historiography of Latin American evangelicalism, however, is organically connected to the lived experience of evangelical Protestants as religious minorities in the region. Critical questions such as who's worth writing about and who matters are deeply relevant to whose record is written down. Similarly, questions of literacy, as many early converts could not read or write, remain relevant to what counts as historiography and the role of oral history alongside. For most of their history, evangelical communities could never have imagined the present political power many wield in Latin America. Instead, most occupied a place of marginalized, overlooked, even violently opposed minority. Beyond simply a window into the lived reality of a religious minority community, Payne's brief account above represents broader realities happening on the ground at the turn of the 20th century. Of course, Payne wielded the language of his day, bloodthirsty mobs, fanatics, etc., that was common to describe Catholics at the time, to describe these events. But more importantly, a critical transnational angle comes into focus, one that will guide our approach. Britons, Americans, Germans, and others became key interlocutors and agents in this story as Protestant missionaries entered Latin America in significant number for the first time in the mid-19th century. The Brethren, for example, an evangelical Protestant movement that began in Dublin and southwest England within the period of 1827 to 1831, played an outsized role in this story, especially in the actual writing of this history. As the 19th century progressed, two realities converged: the independence of many Latin American nations from the colonial powers of Spain and Portugal, and the legacy of the Second Great Awakening in the United States, a Protestant revival movement that flourished from the 1790s to 1830s. Those factors inspired new missionary initiatives from the North and an influx of Protestant missionaries, especially from the United States, into Latin America. As the U.S. took an increasingly aggressive geopolitical stance, especially toward its Latin American neighbors, its role in the shaping of writing of history fused as well. In this brief paper, I've been asked to give an introductory sweep of historiography of Latin American evangelicals, which will necessarily be quite selective. Even in 1967, Presbyterian American missionary John Sinclair noted 3,115 entries in his Protestantism in Latin America, a bibliographical guide. This, in addition to vast yet relatively small stories, such as those highlighted by Pedro Feitosa in his work on missionary writing and the Imprensa Evangélica in Brazil, and many others that have written here and are participating in this conference, small, often overlooked stories that need to be included. But so instead of attempting to be comprehensive, which would take all of our time, we'll pay particular attention to regional nuances, historic turning points, and trends in the literature. At the turn of the 20th century, Latin America experienced domestic and foreign policy tumult in the aftermath of the Spanish-American War of 1898, the resulting Treaty of Paris, which gave the United States temporary control of Cuba and territorial expansion in Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippine Islands. U.S. geopolitical power overlapped with increasing religious fervor across the Republic. While the majority of American missionaries remained fixated upon East Asia and Africa, many turned toward a newly open mission field of Latin America. At the turn of the century in 1901, the year prior to Payne's gripping tale above, Hubert W. Brown gave the students lectures on missions at Princeton Theological Seminary, which he titled Latin America, the Pagans, the Papists, the Patriots, the Protestants, and the Present Problem. Brown's telling of Latin American history was drawn from his own role in this missionary story as a Presbyterian missionary in Mexico City from the 1880s to 1906. Brown's lectures, which later became a multi-volume book, were perhaps the first comprehensive attempt at Latin American Protestant history, broad in geographic scope, including harrowing accounts of violence told by missionaries themselves. This promising start to historiography, especially including Latin America and the broader history of world Christianity, faced significant headwinds. Let us turn then to the place of Latin American Protestantism within world Christianity, which clarifies our particular story, especially why historiography on Latin American evangelicalism lagged behind other regions of the world. In June 1910, 1,200 representatives of 160 Protestant mission societies from around the world gathered in Edinburgh, Scotland, which is the most beautiful city in the world, if you're wondering. The epochal 1910 World Missionary Conference in Edinburgh represents the persistent oversight of Latin America in the place of the history of Christianity. The region had been dominated by Christianity for over 400 years, in stark contrast to Africa and Asia, where Christianity remained marginal for much of their history. But for Protestant observers, the nature of Roman Catholic Christianity called into question its inclusion within the boundaries of global Christianity in the Protestant imagination. In other words, Latin America did not fit neatly within the pre-fitted boxes of Christendom, and according to Brian Stanley, this is how the majority of delegates thought about the world. In the planning stages, fierce disagreement erupted over whether or how to include Latin America in relation to mission work. Since Latin America was thoroughly Roman Catholic, at least in name, was it off limits to Protestant evangelization? Many Anglo-Catholics argued it was already Christianized and bitterly contested the work of Protestant evangelical missionaries in the region. As a result, nearly all Protestant statistics in Latin America were excluded from consideration at the conference. This exclusion of Latin American Protestantism and missionary activity, rather than discouraging Protestant advances, motivated U.S. missionary efforts in the region in particular. In direct response to the oversight of Edinburgh in 1910, 6 years later, North American and Latin American Protestants launched the Congress on Christian Work in Latin America, also called the Panama Congress, which in hindsight was a turning point in the history of Christianity in the region. The 1916 Congress spurred missionary activity, historiography, and even Protestant political visibility, as the president of Panama, Belisario Porras, planned to speak at the Congress even in the face of significant Roman Catholic opposition. The first commission of the Congress, called Survey and Occupation, wrote on Latin America's physical, industrial, moral, social, and religious conditions. It also provided a broad description of the history and status of Protestant missions in Latin America. Commission 4 analyzed the influence of evangelical literature in Latin America with the goal of expanding its curriculum. It's not surprising, then, that Panama inspired some of the most significant historiography in the first half of the 20th century in Spanish and English. But this entire discussion of developments in the first half of the 20th century for evangelicals would surprise many observers. In much of the popular imagination, Protestants did little and wrote little during this time period. But in the words of the Oaxacan writer Gonzalo Baez Camargo, who we'll highlight below, Latin American Protestants refused to, quote, become permanent outcasts from the ecumenical movement, rejected by their brother Protestants in other countries as something like bastards, with little or no right to exist and breathe the ecumenical air, unquote. One of those who took up the Panama mantle was the Brazilian Presbyterian Erasmo Braga, who represented Brazil at the Congress. Braga was a graduate of Mackenzie College in São Paulo, the largest missionary school in Brazil. The year after the Congress concluded, Braga wrote Pan-Americanismo, Aspecto Religioso. Braga connected Christian forms across diverse missionary groups and disparate agencies, opening up crucial dialogue through their shared history. Overall, the Panama Congress set off a flurry of interdenominational cooperation, especially in publishing and education. Alongside Braga, an entire generation would be shaped by Panama's ecumenical ethos, especially in seminaries in Argentina, Cuba, Puerto Rico, Mexico, and Brazil especially. Significant historians and theologians include the Argentine Methodist Sante Huberto Barbiere, Uruguayan Santiago Conclini, the Chihuahua-born Alberto Ramballo with his 1949 Discurso a la Nación Evangélica, and Baez Camargo, who contributed early analysis on Protestant communities during the Spanish Inquisition. Missionary historians include W. Stanley Rycroft, Reginald Wheeler, Webster Browning, and Kenneth Grubb, who wrote various historical volumes in the 1920s and 1930s on mission work among indigenous South American communities. Thomas Goslin would also later write Los Evangelicals en América Latina, Siglo XIX, a sweeping history of mid to late 19th century evangelical work in Latin America. It's worth noting that these missionary and historiographical advances took place within a wider atmosphere of growing anti-Protestant sentiment and anti-American backlash in the region. I'm thinking here, for example, of the Catholic bishops as the Constitutional Assembly of Mexico in 1917, who equated national identity with Catholicism and questioned the identity, Mexicanness, and even Latin Americanness of Protestants. The Panama Canal had also recently been completed, and broader U.S. interventionism heightened the backlash against Americans, and with it, Protestant advances. It's not surprising then to see various British and non-American missionaries exert outsized influence upon missiological and historiographical trends. Out of this group, who largely wrote in the first half of the 20th century, the Scottish Presbyterian John Mackay stands out for providing inspiration and material for later evangelical intellectual construction. In this way, 1916 was also a crucial year for transnational history beyond the Panama Congress. Mackay boarded the SS Canuta that year on a 5-week trip from London to South America. At a time when many global evangelical mission organizations were fixated on Africa and East Asia, as mentioned above, Mackay chose Latin America, and I tell this fascinating broader history in my book, A Gospel for the Poor. Mackay's encounter with Latin American history, culture, and literature convinced him that Christianity in the region lacked local roots. The Christian message had a foreign accent, and this hindered the acceptance of the gospel. Thus, Mackay wrote his most influential book, The Other Spanish Christ, in 1932, as an attempt to diagnose the problems of Latin American Christianity and provide a way forward to an authentically Latin Christ, in his words. In doing so, he recounted the history of Christianity in the region, applying the theme of Christology. Mackay serves as a natural bridge between the first and second halves of the 20th century. As a historian, I've been consistently surprised by Mackay's pervasive influence, and certainly the perception of his influence, on the next generation of Latin American Protestant evangelicals. In a 2013 interview in his Valencia apartment, the Peruvian evangelical Samuel Escobar was explicit with regard to Mackay's legacy on his generation. Quote, the writings of Latin American ecumenical theologians like Emilio Castro and Jose Miguel Bonino, or evangelicals like Rene Padilla or Pedro Arana, show Mackay's pervasive influence, unquote. These thinkers would later write some of the most significant contextualized history and theology from within Latin America. The story of these influential evangelicals, whom I called members of the Latin American evangelical left, brings us full circle back to the beginning of our paper, the Brethren movement. Brethren expertise in publishing, including channels of printing and distribution, played an instrumental role in the later dissemination of Latin American Protestant evangelical history. Because of their lack of hierarchy and practice of robust interchurch negotiation in journals, the Brethren often meted out their own convictions prior to global debates and provided a publishing structure for Latin Americans to later step into their own historiographical and theological construction. Thus, as our own David Bebington wrote, because it adhered to its own standards so fiercely, Brethrenism was well placed to act as a ginger group in the evangelical world. One important bridge between a British missionary tradition and a new generation of Latin American leaders was Alec Clifford, the son of British Brethren missionaries in Argentina. Clifford undoubtedly received his passion for publishing from his parents, as his father, James Clifford, began work in Bolivia in 1895 and subsequently pioneered various publishing projects, many of which continue to this day, including Campo Misionero, which provided news of the wider Brethren work in Argentina. These were not tiny denominational publications either. In 1894, Eglin Harris founded the journal El Sembrador, or The Sower, which at its peak reached a circulation of 500,000 copies per bi-monthly issue, according to the Brethren journal Echoes and Service. In the mid-1970s, El Sembrador had nearly 500,000 copies in circulation. In total, more than 1,200 different tracts and booklets have been published in Brethren circles in Latin America. In 1962, the Spanish student magazine Certeza was founded in Buenos Aires, with Clifford as its founding editor, soon expanding from 3 issues per year to 5 in 1963. And this was a Spanish magazine of the International Fellowship of Evangelical Students. Each had an average printing of 10,000 copies. While Certeza was printed in Buenos Aires, it was distributed also throughout Argentina, Brazil, Chile, Mexico, Peru, Venezuela, Bolivia, Colombia, Ecuador, and what IFES called the countries of Central America and the Caribbean. Its highest circulation was in Argentina, most likely due to Clifford's Brethren networks across the country, and later Samuel Escobar's as well. The IFAS at that time was under the leadership of the Brethren Australian General Secretary Stacey Woods, who also founded the InterVarsity Christian Fellowship in Canada and the United States. As with Woods, Clifford was not content, like many of his colleagues in the United States, to create a dependent ministry based on his own expertise. In 1965, the Executive Committee of the IFES met with the topic of inquiry, how can we help indigenous writing? Clifford mentored younger Latin Americans in publishing work, namely Peruvian Samuel Escobar and Ecuadorian René Padilla, who were both staff members with the IFES and became some of the most influential evangelicals of the post-war period. Samuel Escobar had moved to Argentina from Peru in 1960 and became friends with Clifford that year. There, Escobar recalled his own, quote, horizons began to grow, unquote. Padilla would later take the helm and also expand into his own publishing house, Ediciones Kairos, which specializes in publishing Spanish-language history and theology, many from first-time authors. IFES was, of course, not alone in Spanish-language publications at this time. Other key publications, including Pensamiento Cristiano of the Latin America Mission, which is also founded by Clifford in 1953, Editorial Caribe, and many, many, many others that we could mention. By 1974, IFES claimed that Certeza, though, had become the interdenominational magazine with the widest circulation in Latin America. In these Spanish-language journals and magazines, we see some of the most significant, cutting-edge historiography at a time when wider English-language writing was focused almost exclusively on Catholic stories, such as theologies of liberation and later on Pentecostalism. And this is a key point and one I want to clarify. This is not exporting credit for Latin American evangelical history to Northern sources. Rather, my argument is much narrower, that the structure for publication and including historiography was at key moments provided by earlier forward-thinking missionaries, especially in the Brethren tradition. In other words, the content and agency was thoroughly Latin American, while the structures were transnational in origin. The broader structures of Latin American religion and politics were also facing wider, significant pressure during this time, structural shifts that ushered in our present era of evangelical growth, influence, and surge of historiography. This generation came of age during a significant political and religious upheaval, and I've written at length about this elsewhere. I'm thinking of the Cuban Revolution, Second Vatican Council, of the Catholic Church, etc. Less visible to Western observers were migration trends that laid a foundation for Protestant evangelical demographic growth, visibility, and an explosion of historiography that we see in the present day. In other words, demographic shifts led to significant historiographical shifts. The post-war period ushered in tremendous change for Latin American Protestants and the writing of their history alongside, as many major cities witnessed doubling and tripling of size over a few decades through movement from rural regions to cities. Observers from the North noted and often cheered theologies of liberation in the political environment that gave rise to them. But during this time, many observers and historians failed to note the significant trends shifting across the religious landscape. After World War II, Protestantism began to gain a foothold in Latin America as urbanization provided a new social context for religious life. Protestant churches found acceptance at the margins of this new urban environment, growing in places traditional Roman Catholic structures largely struggled to reach. And I'm thinking especially of Pentecostal churches sprouting up at the edges of major cities. We noted an evangelical left that arose in the shadow of the Cuban Revolution, but this time period also witnessed a significant expansion of Pentecostal efforts in the region. Much of the scholarship on Pentecostalism lagged quite significantly, but became increasingly difficult to ignore as they flexed political muscles. It wouldn't be until the late 1980s and early 1990s when multiple monographs signaled a wider turn toward Latin American Protestant evangelicalism and Pentecostalism within the academic study of religion especially. We should note English language writings such as Edward Cleary and Hannah Stewart Gambino's Power, Politics, and Pentecostals in Latin America, Andrew Chestnut's Born Again in Brazil and Competitive Spirits, as well as Sheldon Anis's God and Production in a Guatemalan Town. Significant Spanish work done by Juan Sepulveda of the Iglesia Misión Pentecostal in Chile and Manuel Gaxiola of the Iglesia Apostólica de Mexico. So many more worth noting both in Spanish and in English, many, many more. I'll also add that anthropologists have often outpaced historians in this regard, providing interdisciplinary encouragement we'd be wise to heed. Today, we continue to see historiographical lacuna, particularly within the history of non-charismatic Protestants, especially within evangelicalism. And this is where I'll close. I want to conclude by saying we're at a crucial moment for historiography on Latin American evangelicalism. Evangelical and Pentecostal Protestants have gained political power in many parts of Latin America. But historians must resist the simple, prepackaged, politically convenient categories that often plague the study of evangelicals here in the United States, for example. While acknowledging shared streams and sources, historians must allow Latin American evangelicalism to display its own agency, one of negotiation, resistance, adoption, and local construction. Many of those who are best equipped to do so are here at this conference, and that gives me hope for the future. Thank you.